some practical information from your Euro MP and they're abroad and looking for stuff to be channeled to them by email, that might be fine. But obviously, people's responses to questions, I mean, especially in perhaps celebrity interviews and personal profiles, is that we're wanting to see their reaction, and we don't really want them to prepare themselves in advance. So it's something we've got to increasingly resist. I mean, these days, I think celebrities' minders are very good at trying to, edit out, surprises and perhaps dictate what they are asked about. And of course, our job is to ask the unexpected. I mean, the second sort of flaw we mentioned earlier, apart from poor research, is probably people who just don't know what they're hoping to get out of an interview. And I've certainly had students who've had long interviews, plenty of rapport going on, but haven't really known what they want out of it. And that's a difficulty, because I think it's a fundamental flaw. I mean, it means that you may well not ask them the questions that you need answers to for when you write it up. You don't really have an idea of what you're wanting to write up and so on. So, I mean, there are times when we go on what they call fishing expeditions, just to find out things out of the blue. But I think we need to have sort of a structure or possible structures. And I do mean that I don't mean writing the story in advance, but just have a good idea of different lines of inquiry that we'd want to explore. For the reasons that we've said, yes, Steinway, it might be suitable to sort of say in general terms, I'd like to ask you about, the background to your, sort of how you became a multimillionaire or whatever. But too many questions, I think, would, in advance, I mean, just put them at their ease. That it's not perhaps a threatening interview, but we don't want them to be, sort of totally prepared. Unless, for example, there's a purpose to it. I mean, with something like Desert Island Discs or similar sorts of interviewing where you're talking to somebody about their life, it might well be that you're sort of saying to them in advance, I'd like you to have a think about, a number of pieces of music that are important to. Obviously, we're going to be talking about them during the program, and so there may be preparation of that kind. And of course, that's also a comforting thing because it gets them thinking about themselves and thinking about where they want to go for their interview. Now, you're helpfully sort of progressing us through some of the advice, and it's nice that it's coming from you. I think that Julie makes a good point that there are two things about the questioning, really. One is that I think sometimes you're asking some simple, easy, gentle sort of questions at the beginning to put somebody at their ease, to get them to relax with you, and so on. I think equally, once you are well into the interview, you might be asking, looking for more challenging questions and more stimulating for them. But Nicola makes a really good point that I think one of the poorest things that we see, and we see plenty of examples of this on TV, but also in written journalism, is people just not listening, perhaps because they're scared, that they won't ask a question in time or whatever. But there's nothing more insulting or more of a waste than not listening to the answer and then just moving on to something totally unrelated. Nicola's right, you do miss a trick. You should have supplementary questions ready. You should spot when somebody's really opening up to you or beginning to open up, and that, perhaps that's where partly the rapport is coming in, but where they're indicating in a subtle way that perhaps they are ready to answer a more demanding question about perhaps a sensitive issue, and then suddenly you just don't pick up on that, ask another totally unrelated question which seems to imply that you haven't heard what they've said. So yes, I'm suspicious of journalists that do too much talking. He said hypocritically standing behind a lecture, but you take the point. I think in newspaper journalism especially, we're there to listen. And the interesting thing on television is how poor many interviewers are, partly because of the nature of chat shows and so on, are often act as a medium for the star rather than as a basis for us to really effectively listen to what the interviewee has got to say. So with the exception of, you know, people like Parkinson and a handful of others who were prepared to ask detailed questions and shut up and listen to the person they were interviewing, many chat show hosts don't actually give their guests any kind of chance to have an input. And the fact that you've got a high-profile person on your show, it's interesting that if you look at a transcript of some TV shows, I mean, perhaps the Graham Norton's was a good example, which is an entertainment format at the end of the day, you might be surprised that some high-profile guest has in fact only said, you know, perhaps 30 or 40 words, none of them terribly revealing. Gilly's point about do you leave a silence to see how they fill it is a really good television technique. It doesn't work quite so well for newspaper people, but it's certainly one that only too well can work to their favour. And part of the controlling thing, of course, people are a bit nervous. They see a mic towards them, and it won't work with the most experienced interviewees, but it's certainly a good technique for encouraging somebody to start speaking and perhaps say something they didn't intend to. So I think you've already mentioned a few of the the key tips, if you like, from different angles. I mean, be prepared, know your angle, know what you want to ask, be flexible, the point that you were making about adjusting to what people are saying, be responsive. I think there's no point, burying your head in the book. If you are taking shorthand, you need to be giving them eye contact and feedback to build up that sort of rapport, and show that you're responding to what they're saying. And again, if you study some of the best interviews, you'll see how important that is, whether it's the humour in your voice or whether it's the fact you appreciate, a difficult point that they're making. On a practical level, and it's funny how often the actual sort of nuts and bolts of setting the right tone and so on are not followed, and silly though it sounds, I guarantee you that it's easy to alienate somebody just by perhaps behaving in an inappropriate way, and that may be because you look uninterested, and that comes across perhaps as being impolite. Clearly there are certain circumstances where how you dress and behave are important, and basically stomping into somebody's house, leaving dirty footprints over their lamb's wool rugs is probably likely to distract them from any sort of questions that you're being asked. The point Nikra made, I'd say, would be one of the top pieces of advice in terms of being a good listener, and picking up on a problem that some of you spoke about earlier, and Nikra's just mentioned it again. Staying in control is a tough one at times. Yes, there can be times when you're happy for your interviewee to run off at the mouth and just let them relax into their stride, and you're happy to hear an anecdote. But there are people that speak too much or speak about the wrong things, and one of the challenges for the interviewer is pulling them back to the subject and keeping them coming back to the point. And as some of you said, obviously some individuals are much easier to interview than others.